Fishing in Troubled Waters Defense. In July 2016, the verdict which went in favor of the Philippines in the case it brought in the Permanent Court of Arbitration, or PCA, against China's claims in the South China Sea and West Philippine Sea created big waves in these disputed waters. The changing tide in the conflict has not come about through the increased weight of international law as increased as it anticipated. It has been swelled due to the unexpected diplomatic sail towards China by the new captain of the ship named Philippines, President Rodrigo Duterte. The United States in toward China Sea seems to have a pragmatic move in the interest of economic concessions and security considerations. And it did indeed calm tensions in the West Philippine Sea for a short while. Then in June 2019, as the Philippines was about to commemorate its historic win in PCA, a Chinese vessel ran over and sunk an anchored Filipino fishing boat near Recto Bank within the Philippines Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ. After the incident, the Chinese vessel left the scene without rendering assistance to the 22 Filipino crew members in the sea. A year before, in June 2018, destructive illegal fishing and poaching activities by Chinese nationals in Scarborough Shoal had been reported by the Filipino fishing community as posing a grave threat to its economic security and the country's marine resources. Against the backdrop of unresolved issues concerning China in the West Philippine Sea, top Filipino officials from the Departments of Defense and Foreign Affairs have criticized Chinese behavior in regard to the Recto Bank incident as a deliberate maneuver which displayed an utter disregard for the safety of the life at sea. Domestic political activists condemned the harassment and also censured Duterte's inaction on the sinking of a Filipino boat in Philippine waters. Despite the diplomatic protest of his Foreign Affairs Secretary and pressure from the opposition, the President was unperturbed about his stance on the West Philippine Sea. He downplayed the maritime incident and dismissed the call to arms to protect and defend the Philippines' sovereign rights in the contested sea. Instead, he talked about staying out of trouble with China and getting real about the country's military capability. Duterte's rhetoric may have blown his armed forces out of the water, but the stark realism of his reasoning brings to the surface the relation between defense capacity and foreign policy. The popular demand for a strong stance in this maritime dispute is driven by national pride, constitutional principles, security interests, and international law. However, these arguments fail to include the critical measure of a country's strategic position, and for Duterte, the Philippines' defense stance is a realistic determinant of his soft stand in the sea row. In light of this, I believe that we can product an insightful policy debate by asking the following questions. How does the Philippines' defense posture serve as an explanatory factor for Duterte's soft policy stance vis-a-vis China in the West Philippine Sea dispute? How can the application of offensive defense during the study of national and international security explain Duterte's preferences for avoiding conflict with China following the Recto Bank incident of June 2019? How can this structural, realist theory of security illuminate key areas of concern in regard to Philippine key areas, defense, and foreign policy? Duterte's policies, position, and defense posture. At the height of media outrage over the Chinese vessels ramming a Filipino recto near Recto Bank on a June 9, 2019, President Rodrigo Duterte's reticence sent a clear and consistent message. The Philippines is not ready to confront China. Duterte held back from his usual fiery oratory while his defense and military officials raised the alarm over what they assessed as unintentional and therefore condemnable act by the Chinese in the territorial waters of the Philippines. When he finally broke his silence of the Qualdes squabble, the president, in his role as commander-in-chief, addressed the Philippine Navy's anniversary celebration on June 17, 2019, with a warning against sowing tension with China over a little maritime incident. He encouraged the Navy to stay out of trouble, saying they simply cannot afford to go to war with China. In his State of the Nation address on July 22, 2019, the President talked about the delicate balancing act needed to avoid armed conflict in the West Philippine Sea and to protect the country's territorial waters and natural resources at the same time. He lamented that the Philippines had lost effective occupation of Scarborough Shoal when its navy retreated in a standoff with China long before his presidency. Offense, defense, jury, and security policy. The ratio of the cost of forces required for an attack to the cost of forces for defense is known as the offense-defense balance. Theoretically, this shows that a state has an advantage and/or incentive for attacking when the cost of doing so is less far than what is required for the defender to hold its position. This also means that the state will more likely take the path at least resistance when the cost of defense is much too high. The ratio of the cost of forces required for an attack to the cost of forces for defense is known as the offense-defense balance. Theoretically, this shows that the state has an advantage and/or incentive for attacking when the cost of doing so is less far than what is required for the defender to hold its position. This also means that the state will more likely take the path at least resistance when the cost of defense is much too high. Developed from a structural, realist worldview, the offense-defense theory works on the assumption that external and systemic forces determine the behavior of states, and that they make decisions that are rational, optimal, and at times opportunistic. Given this explanation, it can be deducted that President Duterte's decision to OPP for conflict avoidance is both reasonable and practical. However, the value reasonable preference for survival of a weak state with no capacity for defense comes at a high price. Robert Jervis, in discussing the deterrence theory, argued that the absence of defense invites disaster. If an opponent of defense weakness after being tested on small issues by an aggressor, the latter will simply means harder. But if the defender cannot be bullied, the other side will try to increase values and interests through peaceful and cooperative means. Considering that military capability is a given structural reality, what a weak state can do as a rational security-seeking actor is so find strategic shelter through defense alliances and partnerships with major powers. Security cover checks aggression and balances the power distribution in the region. This is especially true in the case of the Philippines, which, as I have previously argued, manifests the small state security syndrome. The strategic value of military modernization and defense cooperation should inform the current political debate on Duterte's policy. Instance, in relation to the West Philippine Sea, aside from diplomatic constructions and or legal institutional foundations, a defense built up with allies and security partners is necessary for a stable and rules-based international order. Hence, a deeper understanding of the defense argument can help the Philippine government make better decisions on how it can leverage the PCA's ruling in Balish fishing in troubled waters. And issues about Duterte's keeps Filipinos under threat in West Philippine Sea. Filipinos continue to face threats not only from China's actions in the West Philippine Sea, but uncertainty brought by President Rodrigo Duterte's whims on the issue. On the world's most important diplomatic stage, a more defined President Rodrigo Duterte once told world leaders that the Philippines would reject all attempts to undermine the 2016 Hague ruling that affirmed the country's rights in the West Philippine Sea. In affirming the 2016 Hague ruling, Duterte said the award embodied the majesty of the law as it stood for a truth of reason over rashness, of law over disorder, of amending over ambition. They were marked turned around from his and his administration's previous statement that it would set aside the award to avoid imposing on Beijing. While observers welcomed what they heard the president say, they were not ready to get thrilled. Those words should be substantiated by a consistent follow through on the president's part, they said. Nearly a year after his strongest statement on the issue, Duterte has once again gone the opposite way. Using a recent televised address to disparage his critics, Duterte on May 6 belittled the Hague ruling, saying it should end up in the trash bin. Throughout Duterte's presidency, Filipinos have often had to bear the burden of his flip-flops on the West Philippine Sea. After nearly 5 years, yearly of hollow statements to protect visit islands or assert the country's rights to its own waters, Duterte's words have all but walked back the historic moment when the Philippines asserted its legal victory to the world. This has kept Filipinos under threat not only from China's actions in the waterway but also his own whims on the West Philippine Sea. Before Duterte's near-weekly efforts to speak on the West Philippine Sea issue, the country's recent push to call out China's aggressive behavior in the sea escape had been met with the president's silence. In late March, the National Task Force for the West Philippine Sea, or NTFWPS, flagged the presence of over 200 ships in Julian Felipe Reef, a boomerang shaped shallow coral reef located within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. The statement from the usually silent body would serve as the start of the Philippine government's string of stern remarks on China's behavior and forceful demands for its ships to leave the West Philippine Sea. The Department of Foreign Affairs or DFA and the Department of National Defense or DND have been in step with one another, with Foreign Secretary Theodore Locsin Jr. and Defense Secretary Delfin Lorenzana calling on the China to respect the Philippines' rights. Both Locsin and Lorenzana have also held consecutive phone calls with their counterparts in the United States, the country's only defense treaty ally. Maritime law expert J. Batong Bakal took note of such moves from the Philippine government, calling them long overdue. But Batong Bakal said that while it was in the country's best interest that such actions were undertaken, it was also essential these were sustained. The key is to ensure that they are sustained and to try to recover ground lost in the last 5 years of inaction. Much damage has been done to the country's foreign policy, posture, and legal position on account of careless and reckless statements made over the years, which China will certainly use to blunt any diplomatic initiatives, Batong Bakal told Rappler in a recent interview. Former Foreign Secretary Albert de Rosario echoed this, stressing that the Constitution bound President to defend the country's interests like other chief executives. Duterte must lead in the country's efforts to defend its right as this is what presidents must be relied upon to do. In the Duterte government's recent move to become more vocal against China, Batong Baka noted we cannot discount the possibility that these are only for show, since the administration has demonstrated an ability to flip-flop on various issues. At times, when Duterte spoke candidly about the West Philippine Sea, he often left Filipinos with false choices. When speaking about the Hague ruling, Duterte said he took up suggestions to assert the award but that nothing happened. Malacanang also often claimed that the ruling was limited, as there was no international police to enforce it. In trying to explain the president's remarks likening the Hague ruling to a piece of paper meant for the trash bin, President spokesperson Harry Roque said Duterte has billboard the point because there was no mechanism to enforce it. General international law, as you mentioned rightly, has no police, has no prison. But it's a kind of long-term interest. I think it's better to have for one country with another country. Friends than enemies because this is reciprocity. If you'll be unfriendly to me, I'll be unfriendly to you. And in the long run, I think economic interest, security interest will prevail. Paula to Rappler during a visit to Manila in 2018. Yet in the past few months, some of Duterte's action put in the limbo the country's Business Forces Agreement with the United States, a military deal which experts said would serve as a deterrent of China in the West Philippine Sea. Negotiations between the two sides were ongoing to benefit both parties, the country's diplomats said. In the meantime, maritime experts, members of the academy, and foreign policy experts have debunked the present war arguments on several occasions. Paulak, and speaking on the value of the award, also said that while China's military and economic might is a fact of life, it does not mean the Philippines is any less than its neighbor. This is a fact of life. You cannot change this, but if you are tall and I am short, it does not mean that we are not equal. It is the same with countries. This is not a question of how big you are, how strong you are. It is a question of you have the same as a us. Holding Philippines back. For University of the Philippines, political scientist Herman Krop Duterte's constant flip-flopping of the Philippine Sea was holding the countries back. The recent issue over Chinese vessels swarming reefs, including Juan Pilipe, had been the most prominent issue in the West Philippine Sea so far and had been likened to both the 2012 Scarborough standoff and China's seizure of Mischief Reef in 1995. In this case, the variable that could hold the Philippines back and standing up to the Chinese is our own president, who seems to feel that it is okay for him to try to de-escalate the situation in Julian Felipe Reef even at the cost of compromising our position of the issue because he is a debt of gratitude he owes China, Krop told Rappler. In the earlier years of Duterte's presidency, some parties argued that his move to develop warmer that ties with China could be strategic, coming after the Aquino administration under which relations with Beijing hit an all-time low, but more than halfway in the Duterte's administration, any such strategy, if it all, was unclear. The case was so similar for arguments that Duterte's pivot to China could be then as part of efforts to balance world powers, Batong Bakal said. For one, in the days after Duterte contradicted his statement on the Hagyu ruling made in the UN, the DFA released a statement that the president refers at the multilateral forum where what remained the supreme expression of the Philippines' foreign policy of the Philippine Sea. While the Duterte's administration, inconsistent messaging on the West Philippine Sea keeps Filipinos exposed to the president's changing statements. Krop, the Philippines' changing statements, Krop said the uncertainty may not bode well, especially as the 2022 national elections nears. In recent days, Duterte has taken the claim of his speeches that while the Philippines was grateful to China for offering assistance, including COVID-19 vaccines during the pandemic, he could not compromise on the West Philippine Sea. After years of joke, hyperboles, and backtracking statement, however, will Filipinos still believe him? So, this is what is happening in the world in the hearts of happening. Kim reporting.